Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the first-class line, dressed plainly, a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding him. A man behind him watched with contempt, his arrogance barely contained. What happened next would leave everyone on the plane speechless, and change one life forever. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special one waiting for you. Los Angeles Airport bustled as usual, with people rushing by, conversations blending together, and luggage rolling in every direction. Amid the chaos, a man stood calm in the class line. That man was Keanu Reeves, dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, carrying a well-traveled backpack. There was nothing flashy about him, and because of that, he went unnoticed. However, anyone who looked closely could feel that there was something different about him, not just in his attire, but in the serene aura he carried. While the others seemed hurried and anxious, Keanu stood still, observing the surroundings with calm composure. He didn't mind the stares or the contrast with the other passengers. Behind him stood Victor Harding, a man entirely different from Keanu. In an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that demanded attention, Victor seemed rehearsed in his every movement, as if wanting the world to see that he was important. His eyes scanned the line, and when they landed on Keanu, he couldn't help himself. "First class, huh?" Victor said with a mocking smile. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned his head slightly and looked at him, still calm. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises." Victor seemed to expect a bigger reaction, something that would confirm his assumptions about the man before him, but Keanu remained silent, unaffected by the comment. Victor pressed on. "Look, nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this." He chuckled softly. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." When boarding began, the first-class line moved forward, and both men proceeded with their tickets in hand. Victor walked with confidence, while Keanu remained unaffected by the bustle around him, walking at his usual calm pace. As they entered the plane, the unexpected happened. When Victor reached his seat, he double-checked his ticket and looked up, only to see Keanu settling into the seat next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered in disbelief, shaking his head. He sat down beside Keanu, chuckling under his breath as if the situation was a joke. Of all the seats, it had to be this one. Keanu simply looked at him, still calm, and gave a slight smile. Looks like we're traveling together then." Victor crossed his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. It wasn't just that he was sitting next to Keanu, but the realization that the man he just judged was now sharing the same exclusive space. Keanu's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't understand. As the economy-class passengers finished boarding, Victor decided to start a conversation, but not in a friendly way. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked with the casual tone of someone who thought he already knew the answer but wanted confirmation. Keanu, adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up. "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I see. Commercials, small-time stuff?" Keanu smiled faintly and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor laughed. "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes certain spaces aren't meant for everyone, like first class, for example." Keanu looked at him calmly. "I think we all have our place," he replied, "and sometimes it's exactly where we are." Victor chuckled again. "That's nice, kind of philosophical even, but real life isn't that simple." Keanu didn't respond immediately, turning his attention back to the window as if the conversation had ended. But Victor wasn't finished yet. "You know," Victor leaned slightly toward him, "you might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never truly belong to certain people." This time, Keanu didn't answer with words. He just looked at Victor with an expression that combined patience and subtle firmness, one that said more than words could. Victor, realizing his provocation hadn't worked, leaned back in his seat with a satisfied smile. He thought he had won, but the truth was, this encounter was far from over. Keanu's calmness hid something Victor couldn't foresee, and with every passing minute, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much deeper. As the plane took off, the in-flight service began, and the flight attendant moved through first class offering drinks. Victor made sure to be noticed. "A glass of champagne, please," he said confidently, something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant nodded with a professional smile. When it was Keanu's turn, he simply requested, "Just water, please." Victor couldn't resist. He looked at Keanu with his usual air of superiority and chuckled. "Water? Don't tell me you're gonna waste the experience flying first class with water?" Keanu accepted the bottle the flight attendant handed him and replied calmly, "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor narrowed his eyes, trying to read him, but quickly responded, "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Keanu raised the bottle to his lips and took a small sip, not responding immediately. Passengers began to notice Victor's provocative tone, but since Keanu seemed unbothered, no one intervened. "Maybe the best is different for everyone," Keanu finally said, his calmness unwavering. Victor didn't like the answer. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of the conversation. Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people. The flight attendant, noticing the exchange, briefly considered stepping in but saw that Keanu was handling it well. Keanu simply smiled, turning back to the window. While Victor seemed frustrated, he had wanted to provoke Keanu, but he was beginning to realize that Keanu wasn't so easily rattled. Victor thought he had the upper hand, but his arrogance was starting to make others uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Keanu's calm presence only highlighted his own discomfort. As the flight attendant returned to their section and served another round of drinks, Victor attempted once more to assert his dominance. "You know, life is like flying first class," he began, gesturing with his champagne glass. "You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." Keanu placed his water bottle on the tray and turned to face Victor, his gaze calm but now holding a different weight, as though he was ready to respond more directly. "Luck or hard work," Keanu said softly. "We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The other passengers, who had been observing quietly, began to pay closer attention. The cabin fell almost silent, a few exchanging glances as they noticed the subtle clash between the two. Victor smiled, trying to hide that Keanu's response had hit him. "Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Keanu leaned slightly forward, crossing his arms. His eyes locked onto Victor as he spoke calmly. "The value of being here," he gestured around the first-class cabin, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." The weight of the words settled in the air like a truth that couldn't be ignored. Some passengers exchanged approving glances, nodding lightly, while others took a step back, recognizing the depth of what Keanu had just said. But Victor, clearly unsettled, tried to laugh it off, though his discomfort was becoming apparent. "That's a good one," Victor said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks." Keanu merely smiled briefly, then turned back to face forward, his silence louder than any words. The passengers around them began to shift subtly, noticing the quiet tension between the two men. Some whispered to each other, while others, with a look of respect, admired Keanu's composed response. A couple seated a few rows behind, who appeared to recognize him, remained silent, respecting his privacy, but their eyes conveyed admiration for how he handled the situation. Meanwhile, Victor, now acutely aware of the attention on him, felt a growing unease. As the flight attendant made her rounds collecting empty glasses, Victor, determined not to lose face, tried to keep the conversation going. "You know what's funny?" he continued, his tone condescending. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned slightly toward him, locking eyes, his gaze steady. "I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have," Keanu began, his voice steady, "are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, Victor seemed stunned. His usual sharp responses faltered as he struggled to find something to say. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Keanu's statement, simple yet powerful, had caught him off guard. Some of the passengers around them exchanged glances, some nodding, clearly impressed by Keanu's unshakable demeanor. Finally, Victor managed to regain his composure. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," he said, his tone defensive. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Keanu, still unruffled, leaned back in his seat and replied, "Maybe, but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." His words hung in the air, resonating quietly throughout the cabin. Some passengers nodded discreetly, while others shot Victor disapproving glances. By now, the atmosphere in first class had shifted. The passengers were paying closer attention, and the older man sitting nearby shook his head in subtle disapproval of Victor's approach. Victor, still determined not to back down, fired back. "Cheap philosophy. It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu, with that same peaceful expression, responded simply, "The real world is made by people, Victor, and in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Victor's confident posture started to waver as he glanced around and saw that the other passengers were no longer on his side. His posture shifted from assertive to defensive. The growing realization that he had lost the upper hand was palpable. Keanu, however, remained calm, his demeanor unbroken by Victor's provocation. He turned to Victor, breaking the silence with an even tone. "I understand what you're saying, Victor. The world is competitive, but sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle." Victor, taken aback, raised an eyebrow, unsure whether Keanu was genuinely trying to converse or if this was just another subtle jab. "Inner struggle," Victor said with a chuckle. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Maybe. But I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to fill a void." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Victor fell silent. He absent-mindedly fiddled with the wedding band on his finger, a sign that Keanu's words had struck a chord. But Victor quickly recovered, his defensive tone returning. "That's not me. Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for, and I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Keanu remained calm, carefully choosing his next words. He observed Victor for a few seconds before replying, "I'm not saying you didn't work hard, but sometimes we get so caught up in showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this?" Victor pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. The question lingered in his mind, but he quickly laughed it off. "Who are we?" he scoffed. "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Keanu's expression softened, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I disagree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside." He pointed to his chest, his words resonating through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement, while Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's easy for you to say," Victor retorted, almost rising from his seat. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here." Keanu, without raising his voice, met his gaze with quiet resolve. "You're right. I don't know your story. But I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness." The words landed with such weight that Victor froze. His face paled, and for the first time during their exchange, he appeared genuinely ruffled. Keanu's calmness and wisdom had pierced through his defenses, leaving him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. Flushed with a mix of anger and perhaps a hint of shame, Victor clenched his fists, his knuckles white with the effort of restraining himself. He could feel his composure slipping away, and for the first time in a long while, he was on the verge of losing control. With a sudden, forceful movement, he stood up abruptly, knocking his empty champagne glass to the floor with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the cabin, causing the passengers to freeze in surprise. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice rising with fury. His words rang out, drawing the attention of everyone in first class. "Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life, but you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world." A tense silence filled the cabin, the air thick with shock. The flight attendant, eyes wide, quickly moved toward the scene, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated further. But Keanu, unfazed, remained seated, his expression calm and composed. He waited patiently for Victor to finish his outburst before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," Keanu said, his voice firm but gentle. "I just think that sometimes, we need to stop and think about what really matters." "And Victor," he continued, locking eyes with him, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words seemed to land like a heavy blow, sinking deeply into Victor's chest. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his anger. But something about Keanu's calm tone, his unwavering composure, made Victor hesitate. He slowly sank back into his seat, his gaze diverted, looking more defeated than angry. The confrontation had left him rattled, and Keanu's quiet confidence was causing him to question everything he had just said. The flight continued in an eerie silence after the exchange, the tension hanging thick in the air. Victor, still avoiding Keanu's gaze, seemed to withdraw further into himself, the weight of his own actions settling heavily on his shoulders. Keanu, on the other hand, appeared completely unaffected, almost as though nothing had happened at all. He opened the book, his focus entirely on the words, as if to signal the end of the matter. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile, her voice carrying across the cabin. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her words catching the attention of every passenger. "The captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name, Reeves, hung in the air, reverberating through the cabin like an unspoken realization. A few passengers who had been quietly observing the scene suddenly widened their eyes in recognition. Murmurs of surprise began to spread like wildfire. And that's when Victor froze. "Reeves," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu nodded politely to the flight attendant, thanking her without giving much thought to the growing commotion around him. But then, he turned to Victor, who was staring at him wide-eyed, as if seeing a ghost. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Keanu asked with a slight, knowing smile. Victor's mouth opened, but no words came out. His gaze shifted nervously around the cabin, now filled with passengers who were openly watching him. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others disapproving. For the first time in his life, Victor felt completely exposed. He sank back into his seat, his face flushing with embarrassment. He began to mumble, trying to justify his outburst. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were. I didn't know that you were. You." Keanu remained calm, though his tone carried a quiet firmness. "I didn't think it was necessary," he said simply. "I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Victor was silent for a long moment, his mind racing, still struggling to regain his composure. "Look," he said at last, his voice laced with a mix of frustration and regret, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu let out a small sigh, his expression softening as he leaned forward slightly. "Victor," he said, his voice steady, "what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." The words struck Victor like a lightning bolt. He stared at Keanu, then at the passengers around them, who now seemed even more focused on the exchange. The humiliation he felt was palpable, his face reddening as he absorbed the truth of Keanu's words. He had thought he was winning, that his words had power, but now, it was clear that he had revealed more about himself than he ever intended. Keanu, sensing the moment was complete, decided to offer one final piece of wisdom. "You know, Victor," he began, his voice still calm and steady, "life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger." Victor nodded slightly, unable to argue. His posture had shifted, and for the first time in the entire exchange, he seemed to genuinely reflect on his actions. Keanu leaned back in his seat, effectively closing the conversation. The plane continued its course, but for Victor, everything had changed. As the flight neared its end, Victor sat in silence, replaying the conversation in his mind. The arrogance he had carried with him at the start of the journey had vanished, replaced by something much closer to regret and introspection. For the first time, he questioned his own behavior. How many times had he judged people without understanding them? Maybe he's right, Victor murmured to himself, without realizing it. He looked over at Keanu, who was now reading a book, as if the entire ordeal had never happened. Victor felt an overwhelming sense of confusion, but also something new. The plane began its descent, preparing to land, and for the first time, Victor mustered the courage to speak. He turned to Keanu, his eyes lowered, and said, "I need to apologize. Not for what I said, just because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Keanu looked up at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He waited a moment before responding, his voice filled with quiet wisdom. "I appreciate the apology, Victor. But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, understanding that Keanu's words were more than just an apology. They were a lesson, a chance for change. Keanu's gaze softened, and he added, "Sometimes, what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor remained silent, but Keanu's words stayed with him. He knew that moment could change something inside him if he allowed it. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Victor stood in the terminal, watching Keanu walk away. Fans approached, discreetly asking for autographs and pictures, but Keanu greeted each one with a smile and patience, his kindness evident in every gesture. Victor watched the scene unfold, and as Keanu disappeared into the crowd, he looked down at his hands and sighed. He knew, in that moment, that he needed to change. Keanu's words still echoed in his mind, a reminder that a person's true worth is not defined by their status, but by how they choose to treat others. As the crowd buzzed around him, Victor felt a shift in his heart, a quiet realization that perhaps this encounter wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps it was a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others, or are we striving to become better people? Keanu's words carried a clear lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives of those around you. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation of judgment or conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps, the change you want to see in the world needs to start with you.